My bones are dust. Again. 10th time today. Or maybe it's been 10,000 years. I can't tell anymore because the clock on the wall keeps running backward, forward, sideways, through dimensions that don't have names. Time isn't linear here. It's not even circular. It's broken, shattered into fragments that cut through my consciousness like glass through flesh. And every piece of me exists in a different moment simultaneously. Dying and being born and rotting, and healing in rhythms that would drive anyone else to madness, if madness was still something available to me. But let me rewind. That's funny, rewind, because I don't control when I move through time anymore. The entity does. The thing they told us didn't exist. My name was Marcus Vane. That's what I remember anyway. Though memory here is unreliable because I'm remembering things that haven't happened yet, and forgetting things that occurred 600 years ago last Tuesday. I was 23 when I enlisted in the Imperial Guard, 447th Cadian Shock Regiment, 3rd Company, Gamma Platoon. My father was proud. Told me I'd serve the Emperor with honor, that the Golden Throne watched over its faithful, that protection came to those who held the line against the darkness. They lied, or maybe they believed the lies themselves, which is worse, propagating false hope because you've been so thoroughly conditioned you can't see the programming anymore. I was born on Cadia, before the fall, obviously, because Cadia doesn't exist now, or it exists in 17 different timelines simultaneously, or it never existed at all, depending on which fragment of temporal reality you're experiencing at any given moment. The sky was purple there. That's what I remember most clearly. Looking up as a child and seeing that violet hue stretching from horizon to horizon, the eye of terror visible even during daylight hours, like a wound in reality itself. We didn't think it was strange. It was just the sky, just home. My father was an administrator in the Casarvento Logistics Division. Boring work. Safe work, as safe as anything could be on a world that existed at the edge of the eye. He managed supply requisitions for the garrison forces, pushing data slates across a desk from dawn until dusk, tracking ammunition expenditures and ration distributions and equipment maintenance schedules. Mundane bureaucracy that kept the war machine running. He wanted me to follow him into that life. Take the administrator's examination, secure a position in the municipal logistics network, die at 60 from some mundane illness or toxic exposure from the recycled air, but die with a pension and a small hab unit and maybe enough credits saved to ensure my own children didn't starve. I wanted more. That was my first mistake, wanting something in a universe specifically designed to punish desire. I remember the conversation we had the night before I left for the recruitment office. We were in our HAB unit, 3rd level of residential block, Gamma 7, eating reconstituted protein paste that was supposed to be nutritious, but tasted like industrial lubricant smells. My father was tired. You could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way his eyes had lost whatever spark they'd possessed in youth. 40 years of paperwork had ground him down to a nub of what he might have been. "You don't understand what you're choosing," he told me, his voice flat with the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching too many young men make the same decision. "You think war is glory. You think service means something. They train you to think that. But I process the casualty reports, Marcus. I see the numbers. 90% mortality rate in the first year of frontline service. 90%. You're choosing to become a statistic. The Emperor protects," I said, parroting the phrase they'd been drilling into my head since childhood. Cathedral indoctrination sessions, school propaganda vids, street preachers shouting litanies on corners. The phrase was everywhere, repeated so often it became background radiation, and I'd absorbed it without questioning because questioning was heresy and heresy was unthinkable. My father's expression didn't change. He just looked at me with something like pity, or maybe resignation, and said, "The Emperor is a corpse on a throne 10,000 light years from here. He doesn't know you exist. He doesn't care if you live or die. The protection they promise is a lie they tell to keep people like you marching into meat grinders for the benefit of people who'll never see a battlefield. I should have listened. Should have recognized that he was speaking from a place of knowledge I didn't possess, that his access to casualty reports and logistics data gave him perspective I lacked. But I was 19 years old and invincible in the way only teenagers who haven't experienced real violence can be invincible. I thought he was just old and tired and cynical, thought I'd be different, special, one of the survivors. That was mistake number 2. Thinking I was special in a galaxy that consumed entire civilizations as casually as I'd consume corpse starch rations. The recruitment office was in Kazar Vento's military district, a massive complex of administrative buildings and training facilities that sprawled across several city blocks. The recruitment officer was a man named Dren Kolst, a veteran with 30 years of service and the scars to prove it. He had a nasty one across his left cheek, 3 service studs above his right eye indicating decades of faithful service, and he smiled when I signed the papers. Genuine smile, not the tired grimace my father wore. Like he was proud of me, or maybe just happy to meet his recruitment quota for the month and avoid getting censured by his superiors. "You'll do fine, son," he said, his voice rough from years of shouting orders across battlefields I'd only seen in propaganda vids. The kind of voice that came from breathing toxic air and screaming over artillery and having your throat half crushed by green-skinned hands before your squad pulled you out. The Emperor protects. That phrase again. That cursed, empty phrase they taught us to repeat like sacred writ, like a magic incantation that could stop bullets, or turn aside blades, or make the horrors of the galaxy somehow bearable. I believed it then. 19 years old, fresh-faced, thinking faith and discipline could keep me alive in a galaxy that consumed entire civilizations for breakfast and didn't even bother to remember their names afterward. The indoctrination was so complete, I didn't even recognize it as indoctrination. Just truth, absolute and unquestionable. Drilled into my skull through repetition and social pressure, and the weight of 10,000 years of institutional momentum that ground out any possibility of deviation. Training was brutal but straightforward. They shipped me to a facility on Cadia's southern continent, a sprawling complex of barracks and firing ranges and obstacle courses that turned civilians into soldiers, or broke them trying. Physical conditioning until your body moved without thought, until you could march 50 kilometers with full gear and still have enough energy to dig trenches and hold a lasgun steady. Weapon drills until lasgun operation became muscle memory, until you could strip and reassemble your weapon in total darkness with enemy fire incoming and not even think about the process. Tactical doctrine until you understood your role in the meat grinder they called strategic planning. You were a disposable asset, ammunition expended in the defense of imperial territory, and your job was to die in a manner that inconvenienced the enemy as much as possible before you were replaced by the next batch of recruits. And prayers, endless prayers to a corpse on a throne, words that meant nothing but sounded sacred because everyone else treated them as sacred, and to question that sanctity was to mark yourself as different, which was dangerous, potentially fatal. They never told us what we'd actually face. Not really. Not in terms we could understand before experiencing it firsthand. Sure, they mentioned Xeno's threats, greenskins, Elder the Tyrannid swarms from beyond known space that consumed entire worlds and left nothing but scoured rock. They showed us training vids of chaos cultists, though they edited out the worst parts. The parts that would make you understand that signing up was choosing between certain death as a civilian or probable death as a soldier. They prepared us for war in the abstract. They didn't prepare us for what war actually was in the 41st millennium, for the smell of burning flesh that clings to your nostrils for days, for the sound of grown men screaming for their fathers as they bleed out in trenches, for the weight of knowing your life expectancy could be measured in hours once you hit the front line, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it except keep fighting, because the alternative was execution for cowardice. My first deployment was Tarragon 7, industrial world contested by Orc forces. We deployed via dropship, descending through atmospheric fire that killed 3 transports before they even reached the surface. I remember thinking this was it. This was how I died, burning up in the atmosphere before even seeing the planet I was supposed to defend. But we made it down, crashed hard enough to rattle my teeth, but we made it. The world outside was hell. Manufacturing complexes reduced to rubble by orbital bombardment. Trenches carved through industrial districts that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Artillery dueling constantly, shells screaming overhead in both directions, explosions sending up plumes of dirt and debris, and occasionally body parts. And the stench. Emperor. No, they trained me to say that, to invoke him reflexively. The stench was unbelievable. Cordite and promethium and human waste and decay, all mixed together into an olfactory nightmare that made you gag every time you took a breath, until eventually your sense of smell just gave up and stopped processing it. 6 months of trench warfare. 6 months of living in holes in the ground, eating reconstituted protein paste. Watching men die from artillery or sniper fire, or simply from infections that festered in wounds, because medical supplies were prioritized for strategically valuable personnel, which meant officers and specialists, not basic infantry. We were replaceable, expendable. There were always more recruits coming up behind us. I killed my first sentient being in week 3, big green skin. Must have been 8 feet tall and built like an industrial lifter, came roaring over the trench line with a crude axe in one hand and what looked like a slugger, some kind of primitive ballistic weapon, in the other. He was screaming in that guttural language that was all violence and rage and simple joy and destruction. Just pure aggression given voice. I didn't think. Training took over. Raised my las gun, acquired target, pulled trigger. 3 shots sent a mass. The last bolts burned holes through its chest, and I could smell cooking meat even over the general stench of the battlefield. It kept coming. Orcs were tough like that. Redundant organ systems, high pain tolerance, too stupid to realize they should be dying. 4th shot took its head apart. Literally, the skull exploded in a spray of blood and bone and brain matter that splattered across my uniform and face. I vomited afterward, dropped my lasgun and bent over and heaved up everything in my stomach, which wasn't much because rations had been short that week. My sergeant, a veteran named Harkin, laughed but not unkindly. He'd seen 1,000 new recruits have the same reaction. "Gets easier," he told me, handing me water to rinse my mouth. The water tasted like metal and chemicals, recycled from sources I tried not to think about. Eventually you stop counting. Eventually, they stop looking like people, even the ones that used to be. He was right about the counting. I stopped tracking kills around number 30 because there were too many, and they all blurred together into a continuous stream of violence that became your new normal. Wrong about it getting easier, though. It just got more distant. Like watching yourself commit violence through someone else's eyes, like the person pulling the trigger wasn't really you but some stranger wearing your body like a suit. We held Tarragon 7. Victory, they called it, though we lost 40,000 troops doing it, and the world was so devastated it would take centuries to return to productive capacity. Assuming the Imperium even bothered to invest in reconstruction rather than just abandoning it as a worthless rock. The Munitorum calculated that was acceptable losses. We were assets, not people. Numbers on a logistics slate, ammunition expended in the defense of Imperial territory, written off as easily as you'd write off spent shell casings. I was 21 when I realized the Emperor didn't protect, not a sudden revelation, more like a slow, dawning understanding that built over weeks and months until it became undeniable. We were pinned down in Sector 12, artillery hammering our position so hard, the ground shook continuously and dirt rained down from the trench walls with every impact. 3 hours of bombardment. 3 hours of curling up in the bottom of the trench and praying, there's that word again, that the next shell wouldn't land directly on your position. And I watched Joram die. Joram, friend from basic training. Good man who shared his extra rations when supply lines broke down, who'd pulled me out of a collapsed trench section during the Sector 8 offensive, who had a girl back on Cadia he talked about constantly, even though realistically he knew he'd never see her again, because our survival rate was approaching 0. Direct hit. Artillery shell landed maybe 3 meters from where he was crouched. Not killed instantly. That would have been mercy, and mercy wasn't something this universe offered. The shell took his legs and lower torso, just gone, vaporized by the blast. But the upper half of his body was intact, and his brain was still functioning, and he lived for 4 minutes in a state of agony I cannot adequately describe, screaming for the Emperor to save him, calling out promises that if he survived, he'd dedicate his life to the ecclesiarchy, convert his entire family bloodline to faithful service. Anything. Just please, please let him live. No answer came. No divine light. No miraculous protection like the propaganda vids showed. Just blood pouring out of what remained of his body, his intestines trailing across the trench floor, his hands scrabbling at mud trying to pull himself toward what? Safety? Help? There was no help, no safety. Just death approaching second by second until his body finally gave out and he stopped screaming, and his eyes went vacant. The Emperor protects, Harkin muttered afterward, but his voice was flat, mechanical, going through motions that had become habit rather than belief. I don't think he believed it either by that point, but you don't voice that doubt, because doubt is heresy, and heresy is death, possibly worse than death depending on what the commissariat decides to do with you. So you say the words, perform the rituals, pretend faith is real, because pretending keeps you alive slightly longer. That's when I started to understand. Not consciously. The conditioning was too deep for that, too thoroughly integrated into my thought patterns. But somewhere beneath the trained responses, I began to suspect that everything they'd told us was a system of control rather than truth. The prayers were psychological reinforcement, mantras designed to keep soldiers compliant and willing to die. The faith was a tool to make dying easier, to give meaning to meaningless death. The promises were lies, to prevent people from recognizing the fundamental horror of their situation and rebelling against a system that ground them into paste for the benefit of people who'd never see a battlefield. But I kept fighting because what else was there? Desert and die, they'd hunt you down and execute you publicly to discourage others. Refuse orders and die, shot by your own commissar before the enemy even got a chance. Stand and fight, and probably die, but maybe, just maybe, survive another day. Those were the options. So you chose the option that gave you the highest probability of seeing tomorrow, and tomorrow you made the same choice. And eventually you stopped thinking about it, and just existed in a continuous present of violence and survival. 3 more campaigns followed over the next 2 years. Garrison duty on Mordian Prime, which was boring but at least not actively trying to kill you most of the time. Just the occasional Chaos Cult uprising or Underhive gang war that spilled into the upper levels. Jungle warfare against Elder Raiders on Varoth Ninths, where the trees themselves seemed hostile, and the Elder appeared and disappeared like ghosts. And you never knew if the rustling in the undergrowth was wind or something about to kill you. Urban combat on Sebastian Hive, room-to-room fighting against cultists who'd turned an entire section of the Hive into a charnel house dedicated to powers we weren't supposed to name, but everyone knew about anyway. I was 23, and I'd survived longer than 90% of my intake cohort. The unit commanders started looking at me differently, not with respect exactly, but with a kind of acknowledgement that I'd beaten the odds, that maybe I had whatever qualities separated survivors from corpses. They gave me more responsibility, put me in charge of a fire team, started asking my opinion on tactical matters occasionally, though they rarely actually listened to those opinions because officers didn't take advice from enlisted, no matter how much field experience you had. Then came the assignment that destroyed me. Peripheral reconnaissance on Hydra Station, edge of the Ghoul Stars. where reality got thin and strange things bled through from places that shouldn't exist according to Imperial doctrine but somehow existed anyway. Command called the mission routine. Survey the station, check for chaos corruption, report back. Nothing complicated, nothing we hadn't done a dozen times before on a dozen different worlds and stations, and forgotten installations scattered across the galaxy. We were a small unit, 20 soldiers, 2 Chimera transports, standard equipment. The station had gone silent 3 weeks prior. Probably just equipment failure, they said. Maybe orc raiders, though what orcs would be doing that far out was anyone's guess. Maybe pirates, clear it out, secure it, move on to the next assignment. Should have known better. Should have recognized the pattern. When command says something is routine, that's when you should start worrying, because if it were actually routine, they wouldn't be sending combat troops. Hydra Station was old. Older than records indicated. We realized the moment our chimeras docked at the external airlock and we breached the outer hull. The architecture was wrong. Not chaos wrong with flesh and eyes and impossible geometry, but wrong in a different way. Pre-imperial construction, maybe even Dark Age technology, corridors that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them, materials that didn't match any standard building codes, lighting that flickered in patterns that almost seemed meaningful if you stared too long. But no visible threats, no bodies, no signs of fighting, no blood splatter or last burn marks or bullet holes or any of the usual evidence that indicated violence had occurred. Just empty corridors and silent chambers, and the sense that we were walking through something that had been abandoned for reasons no one had bothered to record. Too empty. Like the station was holding its breath, waiting for something. We cleared room after room, section after section, finding nothing but abandoned equipment and dust and occasionally religious icons. Imperial aquillas, mostly, but also some symbols I didn't recognize from any approved iconography. Someone had lived here once, worked here. The station had a chapel, small but well-maintained until recently, with rows of pews facing an altar where a 2-headed eagle spread its wings in the approved imperial fashion. Candles long since burned down to nubs, prayer books still open to pages worn from repeated reading. "Doesn't make sense," Vorus said. Sergeant Vorus, unit commander, 20 years of service, and the kind of man who'd seen enough strange things that he didn't dismiss anomalies lightly. If they evacuated, why leave everything? If they were attacked, where are the bodies? Where's the evidence? No one had answers. We kept moving deeper into the station, following standard clearance procedure, checking every room, every corridor, every maintenance shaft, and finding nothing. Absolutely nothing except this overwhelming sense of wrongness that made your skin crawl and your instincts scream at you to leave, get out, run back to the chimeras and report the station as lost and let someone else deal with whatever this was. We found the source in Section Omega, deep in the station's core where the warp drive had been installed millennia ago. The doors were sealed, not locked, but sealed, welded shut from the inside with industrial-grade metal and then covered with prayers written in what looked like blood. Someone had tried very hard to keep whatever was in there contained. "Breach it," Voraz ordered. And we complied because that's what soldiers do. Follow orders even when those orders are obviously stupid. Because the command structure is all that keeps military operations from dissolving into chaos. And chaos gets everyone killed. We cut through the door with plasma torches. Took 20 minutes. The metal was thick, reinforced, and whoever had sealed it had done a thorough job. When we finally breached through, the smell that wafted out was wrong. Not decay. Decay I would have recognized. This was different. Smelled like ozone, and something sweet and something that didn't have a comparison in normal human experience. Like trying to smell a color that doesn't exist in visible spectrum. Inside, the chamber was covered in symbols. Carved into the walls, the floor, the ceiling, every surface bore intricate geometric patterns that hurt to look at, made your eyes water and your thoughts slip sideways into concepts that didn't translate to human language. not chaos iconography. I'd seen enough of that on Sebastian Hive to recognize the eight-pointed star and the symbols of the different chaos powers. These were different, older, more fundamental somehow, like they represented something that existed before human concepts of good and evil, order and chaos, even before the walk itself coalesced into its current state. Heretical markings, Voraz declared, which was the standard imperial response to anything incomprehensible. Label it heretical, destroy it, move on without understanding because understanding might corrupt you. Prepare incendiary charges. We're sterilizing this section and then reporting back for exterminators' consideration. That's when it appeared. Not physically. Not in any sense that makes spatial reasoning possible. It didn't walk through a door or materialize in front of us or announce its presence in any conventional way. It was just suddenly there, existing in the space between moments, occupying dimensions we don't have sensory organs to perceive. And I felt time itself fracture around me like dropping a glass on a concrete floor and watching it shatter into 1,000 pieces. The entity didn't have form. Trying to describe it is like trying to explain color to someone born blind. The framework for understanding doesn't exist in human neurology. It was angles that bent through dimensions we don't have, colors that existed outside visible spectrum, sounds that weren't sounds but temporal distortions given auditory form, and a presence. An overwhelming presence that wasn't malevolent or benevolent, but simply beyond human moral categories entirely. Operating according to logic that had nothing to do with human concepts of purpose or intention or consciousness itself. One of my squad members, Trooper Gant, fired his last gun. Panic response, pulling the trigger because shooting things was what we'd been trained to do when confronted with threats. The last bolt went into the entity, or through it, or toward it, and came out 17 seconds before he pulled the trigger. Effect preceded cause. The shot hit Trooper Hask, who hadn't even entered the room yet, was still in the corridor outside checking R6, burned a hole through his chest plate and cooked his internal organs. He died confused, not understanding what had killed him or why. Causality broke. Effect preceded cause. Time stopped being a line from past to future and became a knot. Became something twisted and recursive, and fundamentally wrong according to every natural law that governs how reality is supposed to function. Then it touched us. Not physically. It didn't have physical form to touch with, but it interacted with us, acknowledged our presence, and that acknowledgement was enough to drag us into its distortion field. I felt myself age 30 years in a single second. Felt my skin tighten and wrinkle. Felt my bones become brittle. Felt my muscles atrophy and my joints stiffen with arthritis. Felt my teeth loosen in my gums and my vision cloud with cataracts, and my hearing dull and every other symptom of aging, compressed into a single heartbeat of sensation, that my mind still running at normal speed, still processing information at normal human rates, experienced with complete, horrible clarity. I was 23. Then I was 53. My body transformed in an instant, while my consciousness remained unchanged, aware, experiencing the transformation with full sensory detail. The pain was indescribable. Not the sharp pain of injury, but the deep aching pain of decay, of systems shutting down, of cellular function degrading past the point of sustainability. My heart struggled to pump blood through arteries that had accumulated decades of plaque in a second. My lungs couldn't properly expand because my rib cage had ossified beyond flexibility. My spine compressed, shortened, made me hunch forward under gravity I could no longer effectively resist. Then I reversed. Snapped back to 23 like a rubber band pulled and released, the temporal distortion yanking me back to my original state. My body was young again, functional again, but my mind remembered the aging. Held both states simultaneously. Old and young, dying and alive. Temporal paradox made flesh that shouldn't be possible, but was happening anyway because the entity existed outside normal causality, and its presence rewrote the rules. I screamed, not from pain, though there was pain, incredible pain as cells died and regenerated and died again in rapid cycling. But from the sheer wrongness of experiencing time as a variable rather than constant. Time was supposed to move forward, 1 second per second, past to future in orderly progression. That was reality. That was how consciousness worked. But now time was broken, and I was broken with it, and nothing made sense anymore. Around me, my squad members were experiencing their own temporal nightmares, each one caught in the entity's distortion field and subject to its effects. Vora's aged backwards. I watched him become a teenager, then a child, then an infant, then a fetus, then cellular matter, then nothing at all. His screaming stopped at age 5 when his vocal cords became too small to produce adult sounds. By the time he reached infancy, he wasn't even screaming anymore, just making confused infant noises. And then he was gone, erased from existence by de-aging past the point of conception. Trooper Hask. No, Hask was already dead, killed by time-reversed lasgun fire. Trooper Cohen, then. I watched Cohen age forward. His body rapidly mummified, skin pulling tight over bone, moisture evaporating, organs desiccating, until he was a standing corpse that looked like it had been dead for decades. But his last moment of life had been frozen in temporal amber. So he remained standing upright, a mummified corpse still holding his lasgun in guard position, eyes vacant and skin like parchment. Others flickered, existing in multiple time frames simultaneously, their bodies cycling through ages so rapidly they became blurs, and I could hear them screaming across multiple timelines at once. The same voice at different ages, all screaming together in horrible harmony. I watched Trooper Yenig live his entire life in 30 seconds. Childhood on some distant agri-world, adolescence, training, deployment, death from a future battle that hadn't occurred yet. All compressed into a simultaneous experience that broke his mind in ways that turned his screaming into laughter, into glossolalia into silence, as his brain gave up trying to process contradictory temporal information. The entity didn't attack, didn't fight. It just existed, and its existence warped time around it like gravity warped space, and we were caught in that distortion like insects in amber. Like moths that had flown too close to something that wasn't fire, but was equally capable of destroying us. I tried to run. My body moved forward. At least I think it moved forward. But time moved backward. So I ran in reverse, my consciousness experiencing forward motion, while my body retreated through space I'd already crossed. Contradictory sensation, moving and not moving, advancing and retreating. Like running in a dream where your legs won't work properly, except this was worse because the disconnect between intention and result was fundamental, temporal rather than just neurological. Then I hit the concentrated core of the distortion field, the space where the entity existed most completely. Time stopped being sequential. My entire life, past, present, future, alternative timelines, might have beens, never-wheres. All collapsed into a single eternal moment of simultaneous experience. I was being born. I was dying of old age. I was fighting on Tarragon 7. I was burning on some future world I'd never reached. I was sitting with my father as a child, listening to him explain logistics systems. I was rotting in a grave on a world I didn't recognize. I was existing in every possible moment of my existence simultaneously. Every choice branching into new timelines. Every timeline collapsing back into a singular point of awareness that couldn't possibly hold all this information but had to anyway, because the entity's presence left no alternative. My body aged 100 years in 5 seconds. I felt bones turn brittle and snap under their own weight. Felt my spine compress and collapse into powder. Felt my skin become parchment, then leather, then slough off entirely like I was a snake molting, except there was no new skin underneath, just exposed muscle and sinew. Felt my organs shut down one by one, kidneys failing, liver ceasing function, heart stopping mid-beat, all while my brain, somehow preserved in the temporal distortion, continued to think at normal speed, continued to process input, continued to be aware. I experienced death, complete biological death. Cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, brain death, cellular necrosis, every system shutting down simultaneously. I died. Then I snapped back, 23 again, alive, whole, heart beating, lungs breathing, but remembering dying with perfect clarity. The memory didn't fade like dreams fade. It was real, permanent, carved into my consciousness like letters carved into stone. The entity moved, or didn't move but shifted through temporal dimensions that don't have spatial equivalents. And I felt it touch my consciousness directly, not malicious, not curious, simply indifferent, acknowledging my existence the way you might notice an insect before accidentally crushing it underfoot. I wasn't significant to it, wasn't even particularly interesting. Just another temporal anomaly in the distortion field it generated by existing. Time fractured around me again. I aged 60 years. De-aged to childhood, I remembered being 10 years old on Cadia, remembered details I'd forgotten decades ago, felt them as present and real as anything in my adult life. Aged 200 years until I was mummified bones held together by sheer temporal impossibility, existing long past the point where biological matter should have completely decomposed. Became 23 again. The cycle repeated, and repeated, and repeated again. Each iteration was faster than the last. Within minutes, if minutes even meant anything in this space where time didn't flow linearly, I was experiencing entire lifetimes in the space between heartbeats. Born and aged and died and reborn thousands of times per second, while my consciousness, trapped in normal time perception for reasons I couldn't understand, experienced every single iteration with full clarity. I stopped screaming because my vocal cords aged to dust. They regenerated, aged again. The sound I made wasn't human anymore, wasn't even screaming in any conventional sense. Just temporal distortion given voice, a noise that existed in multiple time frames simultaneously, the sound of someone dying across 1,000 different timelines all at once. The others in my squad were gone, dead, disintegrated, scattered across time, or simply erased from causality entirely. Their bodies, what remained, were temporal debris, fragments of existence that didn't quite add up to complete people anymore. I was alone with the entity in a bubble where time meant nothing and everything, where I'd been experiencing this horror for 5 minutes and 5 centuries simultaneously, and both measurements were equally true and equally meaningless. My mind should have broken. Complete psychological collapse, consciousness shattered into fragments that couldn't maintain coherent thought, sanity evaporating under the strain of processing impossible information. That would have been mercy. That would have been an ending. Instead, I adapted. Human consciousness is horrifyingly resilient when it has no other option. When breaking would be a relief but isn't available, the mind finds ways to continue functioning even under conditions that should be absolutely impossible. I learned to experience non-linear time. Learned to hold contradictory temporal states in my awareness simultaneously. Learned to remember futures that hadn't occurred and forget pasts that had. My identity became fluid. Marcus Vane at 23. Marcus Vane at 87 dying of age-related organ failure. Marcus Vane at 16 before military service, all existing in the same eternal moment, all equally real, all equally me. The entity kept me. Not deliberately, I don't think it even registered me as sentient, just as another piece of matter caught in its distortion field. But my temporal state became locked to its presence, unable to separate. Consciousness, bound to the warp anomaly like a fly fossilized in amber that would remain preserved and aware forever. Time became subjective. That's not quite accurate. Subjective implies choice, implies some degree of control over perception. I had no control. Time became a substance I existed within rather than something that moved around me. like being submerged in liquid that was simultaneously freezing and boiling, flowing forward and backward and sideways through dimensions that didn't correspond to any human understanding of spatial relationships. I experienced centuries in seconds, seconds that lasted decades. I watched myself age through entire lifetimes, then reverse, then age differently, following temporal paths that branched and converged and looped back on themselves in patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't horror, if they weren't composed of my own dissolution and reconstitution repeated endlessly. I died thousands of times, each death distinct and horrible and perfectly remembered because my consciousness never shut down, just kept experiencing, kept witnessing, kept being aware as my body underwent temporal transformations that should have killed me permanently, but couldn't because death itself was subject to the same temporal distortion that trapped me. Old age. That was the most common death. I experienced complete biological senescence more times than I could count. Organs failing, systems shutting down. Consciousness fading not into oblivion, but into a state where I was aware of being dead. Aware of cells ceasing function, aware of brain activity declining to nothing while somehow remaining aware through the entire process, then snapping back to youth before the awareness could fully terminate. Disease. I experienced plagues that ravaged my body, infections that consumed flesh, cancers that metastasized through every organ system. I felt tumors grow inside me, felt my immune system fail, felt fever burn through neural pathways while I remained trapped in a body that was killing itself. Time would reverse before complete death, healing the disease, then accelerated again in different patterns. Cellular breakdown. This was worse than disease. I experienced my cells simply stopping, mitochondria ceasing energy production, cell walls degrading, DNA strands unraveling. I existed as a collection of dying cells that somehow maintained enough coherence for consciousness to persist, feeling my body decompose from the inside out at the molecular level. Then reconstruction, cells rebuilding, life returning, only to break down again along different trajectories. Rapid decomposition, time acceleration that aged me past death and into decay. I felt my flesh rot, felt bacteria consume muscle tissue, felt my body liquefy and collapse into component elements while my consciousness, impossibly, horrifically, remained aware throughout the entire process of becoming carrion. Maggots that didn't exist eating flesh that was simultaneously alive and dead, bones exposed to air that was breathed by lungs that had decomposed hours ago. Temporal contradictions that shouldn't be survivable, but were because survival and death had both become meaningless categories. I tried to end it permanently. When I had hands, in the moments when my body existed in a state that included functional hands, I tried everything I could think of to damage myself beyond the entity's apparent ability to regenerate. I tried to tear open my own throat, dug my fingers into flesh, ripped through skin and muscle, felt blood pour out in hot streams. The wound aged backward and healed, flesh knitting together in reverse, blood flowing back into veins. I watched it happen, felt it happen. The injury disappeared as though it had never existed. Temporal reversal, undoing damage faster than I could inflict it. I tried to stop my own heart, pressed my hands against my chest, focused every bit of will I possessed on simply stopping the cardiac muscle from contracting. Sometimes it worked. My heart would stutter, stop, and I'd feel death approaching. Then my body would de-age to a younger state, where the heart was stronger, more resilient, and it would resume beating with renewed vigor. Or time would reverse and the heart would never have stopped at all. I tried to damage my brain. That was desperation speaking. The recognition that if I could just destroy the part of me that was still experiencing normal consciousness, maybe I'd find oblivion. Maybe awareness would finally terminate. I slammed my head against walls that existed in multiple time frames, tried to induce stroke by whatever means available, tried to cause trauma severe enough that neural tissue couldn't possibly maintain coherence. The entity's temporal field regenerated the damage before it could register as permanent. Brain tissue would decompose, cells would die, neural pathways would sever, and then time would reverse or jump sideways, and the damage would be undone. My brain restored to some earlier state where the injury hadn't occurred. I remained aware throughout all of it, aware of dying, aware of healing, aware that there was no escape through self-destruction, because destruction itself was temporary in a place where time didn't flow consistently. Suicide wasn't possible when time didn't move forward reliably. Death required permanence, required the past state of being alive to transition irreversibly into the future state of being dead. But in the entity's distortion field, past and future were fungible concepts. Death could be undone by temporal reversal, could be skipped over by temporal acceleration, could occur and not occur simultaneously in a superposition of states that violated every principle of classical physics, but was apparently perfectly acceptable to whatever alien logic governed the entity's existence. So I existed, trapped, experiencing every possible version of my aging and death and rebirth simultaneously, forever, in a state that wasn't life or death but some horrible synthesis of both. The entity remained, constant, unchanging in ways I wasn't, existing in some stable temporal state that I couldn't comprehend. It didn't communicate, didn't acknowledge my continued existence beyond that first moment of contact. I was background noise to it, temporal debris caught in its wake, not significant enough to notice, let alone address. I tried to understand it anyway. What else was there to do? I couldn't escape, couldn't die, couldn't even maintain a consistent temporal state. So I observed. I studied. I tried to find patterns in the temporal distortions, tried to understand the logic, if logic even applied, that governed how the entity interacted with reality. It existed in multiple time frames simultaneously. That much became clear through repeated observation, across what felt like decades of imprisonment, but might have been minutes or centuries, depending on which temporal reference frame you measured from. The entity's form, such as it was, occupied past, present, and future concurrently. It had always been in that chamber, would always be in that chamber. All statements were simultaneously true, because linear causality didn't apply to its existence. The symbols carved into the chamber walls weren't decorative, they were functional, warnings maybe, or containment mechanisms, or attempts by previous inhabitants to communicate with or constrain the entity. I couldn't read them. They weren't Imperial Gothic or any language I recognized, but I could see how they interacted with the temporal distortions. The symbols created patterns in the flow of broken time, channels that guided or redirected temporal energy in specific ways, and where they'd been damaged or removed, the distortions were stronger, more chaotic. Someone had known this thing was here, had tried to contain it or at least mitigate its effects. The welded doors, the prayers written in blood, prayers that hadn't worked, hadn't provided any protection. Because they were just words written by desperate people who'd been taught that faith could solve problems that required actual understanding. Those people were gone now, dead or scattered across time or aged out of existence. Only their warnings remained, and we'd ignored them because imperial doctrine prioritized destruction over comprehension. I wondered how long the entity had been here. Years? Centuries? Millennia? Was it native to this dimension, or had it come from elsewhere, from the warp, or from some other reality entirely? Was it even sentient in any sense I could recognize, or was it more like a natural phenomenon, a temporal storm that destroyed without intention or malice? No answers came. The entity didn't respond to my questions. I tried asking, tried screaming inquiries into the void, but received nothing back except my own voice echoing across multiple time frames. It existed. I existed. Those were the only certainties. My sense of self began to fragment around what I arbitrarily designated as Year 5, though time measurement had become increasingly meaningless. I was Marcus Vane, 23-year-old Imperial Guardsman. I was also Marcus Vane at 47, grizzled and bitter, and Marcus Vane at 72, one body failing but mind still sharp. and Marcus Vane at 16, before military service, all simultaneously, all equally real, all occupying the same space in different temporal states. My memories became non-linear. I remembered my father's death. He died of industrial accident when I was 12. I also remembered attending his funeral when I was 35, decades after I'd been trapped in the temporal anomaly. I remembered conversations we'd never had, futures that never occurred, alternate timelines where I'd listened to his advice and never enlisted and died anyway when Cadia fell or didn't fall or fell differently. The contradiction should have been maddening, should have broken whatever remained of my sanity. Instead, I adapted, again. Because consciousness doesn't have the luxury of breaking when there's no alternative state available. I learned to hold multiple contradictory memories simultaneously. Learned to accept that I'd both experienced and not experienced events, that my past was fluid, that memory was just another temporal variable subject to the same distortions as physical reality. I lost track of who I was, the core identity that defined Marcus Vane, the personality, the beliefs, the sense of continuous self that connected past experiences to present awareness, began to dissolve under the weight of experiencing too many different versions of myself simultaneously. Was I the young recruit full of indoctrinated faith? The disillusioned veteran who'd seen too much death? The old man dying alone? All of them? None of them? Something else entirely that existed in the synthesis of contradictory states? Language became difficult. I'd think in words appropriate to my current age, whatever age that was in any given moment. But the vocabulary shifted as I aged and de-aged, and aged differently. Complex grammatical structures that made sense in one temporal state became incomprehensible in others. I started thinking in images instead, in sensory impressions that transcended linguistic representation, because images could hold contradictory information that language couldn't express. The station around me decayed. I watched it happen across compressed centuries. Metal corroding, systems failing, the structure gradually succumbing to entropy. Then it would reverse. The decay would undo itself, restoration occurring backward through time until the station was pristine again. Then decay would resume along different trajectories, different patterns of failure, different speeds of deterioration. Sometimes I saw people. Ghosts, maybe, or temporal echoes of individuals who'd been here in the past, or would be here in the future. They moved through the chamber, ignoring me or unable to perceive me, because I existed in different time frames than they did. I saw the original crew, the ones who'd first discovered the entity and tried to contain it. Saw their fear, saw them die in slow motion, or fast forward or backward through time. Saw their bodies age and decay and disappear. I saw Imperial forces arrive to investigate, maybe my own unit, maybe different soldiers from different time periods. I couldn't tell anymore. Saw them breach the sealed chamber, saw them encounter the entity, saw them die or become trapped like me, temporal states fragmenting until they ceased to be recognizable as human. Some of them screamed, others just disappeared, existence terminating so completely it was like they'd never been at all. I tried to warn them, tried to shout, to wave my arms, to make them understand the danger. But I was operating on different temporal frequencies than they were. My shouts arrived before they entered the room or years after they died. My gestures occurred in time frames they couldn't perceive. I was a ghost to them, if they could perceive me at all, a temporal anomaly that might register as a flicker in their peripheral vision, but nothing more substantial. That was one of the worst realizations. I couldn't warn anyone, couldn't prevent the cycle from continuing. People would keep coming to this station, would keep investigating, would keep breaching the containment that had failed millennia ago, would keep encountering the entity and dying or becoming trapped like me. And I could only watch it happen, helpless, unable to communicate across temporal barriers that separated my existence from theirs. The horror became philosophical around what I arbitrarily designated as Decade 3. The immediate physical horror, the aging, the dying, the constant temporal distortion, had become normalized. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but familiar enough that it no longer shocked me. The real horror was deeper, more fundamental. This is what the Imperium was, what it had always been. The entity was just a more obvious version of what humanity had built for itself. The Imperium was a temporal trap just like this one, a system that caught people and ground them down, and destroyed them, and they couldn't escape because all the exits had been sealed millennia ago by decisions made by people long dead. The Emperor on his golden throne was no different than this entity. Both were things from outside normal human experience. Both warped reality around them. Both destroyed people who came into contact with them. Both were worshipped, or at least treated with reverence by people who didn't understand what they actually were. The entity didn't protect me. The Emperor hadn't protected my squad on Tarragon 7, or Joram bleeding out in the trench, or any of the billions of humans who died in service to the Imperium believing they served something that valued them. Protection was a lie. A comforting fiction to make people compliant, to make them willing to die for systems that consumed them without consideration or care. The prayers I'd been taught were just noise, sounds without meaning, rituals without power. I'd prayed to the Emperor for deliverance from this temporal trap more times than I could count. No answer came, never came, would never come, because the Emperor, if he still existed in any meaningful sense, was a corpse on a throne 10,000 light-years away who didn't know I existed and wouldn't care even if he did know. The protection promised by imperial doctrine was propaganda, psychological conditioning designed to keep populations obedient. The system perpetuated itself. That was its only function, its only purpose. Not to protect humanity or guide it towards some greater destiny or defend it against genuine threats, just to perpetuate its own existence, to continue grinding through human lives forever, because that's what systems do when they become large enough and old enough that their original purpose has been lost or corrupted beyond recognition. The Imperium existed to preserve the Imperium. Everything else, the territory, the wars, the faith, the sacrifice, was just fuel to feed the machine. And faith was the key mechanism of control. If you could make people believe that suffering had meaning, that sacrifice was noble, that dying in service to the Imperium earned you some kind of eternal reward, or at least prevented eternal damnation, then you could keep them fighting and dying forever. You could burn through populations like ammunition, because there would always be more recruits, convinced they were serving something greater than themselves, when really they were just being consumed by a machine that had long ago lost any purpose beyond self-perpetuation. My father had been right. Should have listened to him. Should have taken the administrator position and died at 60 from industrial disease instead of this. At least that death would have been final, permanent. This was worse than death. This was existence without end, without purpose, without even the mercy of degradation into unconsciousness. The entity wasn't evil. That would imply intention, malice, consciousness making choices. It was just a thing that existed, and its existence caused harm to beings that came into contact with it, because those beings weren't adapted to handle the kind of reality distortion it produced. Like radiation, not malicious, just deadly to organic tissue that had evolved in environments without significant radiation exposure. The Imperium was the same. Not evil in the sense of consciously choosing to harm people, but harmful by nature, by structure, by the fundamental logic of its operation. A machine too large and complex for anyone to fully understand or control that ground through human lives as part of its normal function. And people worshipped it, died for it, thought it protected them. Just like I'd thought the Emperor protected me, right up until Joram died screaming for salvation that never came. I lost the ability to feel emotions around what I arbitrarily designated as Century 1. Not permanently, they'd return when I de-aged to states where my neurochemistry still supported emotional response. But increasingly, I existed in emotional states that were flat, neutral, beyond affect. Not numb, exactly. More like observing emotions from outside. Recognizing that the younger versions of me felt fear or anger or despair, but not actually experiencing those states myself in the current moment. Fear became observation. This temporal state is degrading rapidly, which the younger version of me would find terrifying. Anger became acknowledgement. The injustice of this situation would provoke rage in previous iterations of my consciousness. Despair became analysis. The apparent permanence of this imprisonment suggests that earlier versions of me were correct to feel hopeless about escape possibilities. Watched young Marcus scream and cry and rage against his imprisonment. Watched middle-aged Marcus sink into depression so profound he stopped trying to track time, or understand the entity, or do anything except exist in minimal functional capacity. Watched old Marcus achieve a kind of bitter acceptance, a recognition that this was permanent, and screaming about it wouldn't change anything, so why waste the energy? All of those emotional states were me, were Marcus Vane at different points in the indefinite span of temporal distortion. But the me that was aware in any given moment, assuming moment meant anything in this context, didn't necessarily feel what those other versions felt. I could observe their emotional states, like watching recordings of someone else's life, recognize the patterns, understand the progression from shock to despair to acceptance, but not actually experience the emotions myself, unless my current temporal state happened to coincide with the age when those neurochemical responses were active. This was, I realized after extensive observation across what felt like centuries, a mercy. If I'd maintained full emotional capacity throughout the entire experience, if I'd felt the full weight of horror and despair for every second of subjective time I'd experienced, I would have gone genuinely insane. Would have broken so completely that consciousness itself would have fragmented beyond any possibility of coherent thought. The emotional flattening was adaptation. Survival mechanism, the mind shutting down systems that would cause damage if allowed to operate continuously under these conditions. My body became abstract. I'd spent so long experiencing different ages, different states of decay and regeneration, that I stopped identifying with any particular physical form. Was I young or old, healthy or dying, intact or decomposed, all of the above? None of the above. My body was a variable that changed constantly, and attaching identity to something that unstable was counterproductive. I started thinking of my body as the construct. Not me, not Marcus Vane in any essential sense, just the physical structure that housed consciousness, whatever consciousness meant in a context where my thoughts occurred across multiple time frames simultaneously. The construct would age and die, would regenerate and age differently, would experience pain or numbness, or sensations that didn't correspond to anything in normal human experience. And I would observe it happening, recognize it as information about my current state, but not identify with it as me in any deep sense. This was probably what they'd been trying to achieve with the servitor conversion process. The Mechanicus didn't bother with temporal distortion, just physical modification, replacing biological components with mechanical ones, until so little humanity remained that the servitor stopped thinking of itself as a person and became just a tool. Different method, same result. Consciousness divorced from physical identity, aware but not attached, functional but not whole. I'd become my own servitor. Self-inflicted through prolonged temporal trauma, rather than imposed through technological modification. But the end state was similar. I existed, I observed, I processed information. But I'd lost whatever quality made that existence personal, made it matter in ways beyond pure function. The prayers echoing in my memory became bitter jokes. The Emperor protects. Protects what? From what? I was Imperial Guard, as loyal and faithful as the indoctrination could make me. And where was the protection? Trapped in a temporal anomaly, dying repeatedly, consciousness imprisoned in states that shouldn't be survivable. If this was protection, I'd hate to experience abandonment. In His name we serve. Serve by suffering? Serve by becoming temporal debris? Serve by existing as a warning no one could perceive? What service was I providing? What purpose did my imprisonment serve, except as evidence that the universe was hostile, and faith was worthless, and the systems we'd been taught to trust were lies built on older lies that no one questioned? Because questioning was heresy? Only in death does duty end. Even that was a lie. Duty didn't end in death. Not here. I died thousands of times, and duty kept dragging me back, kept regenerating the body that housed consciousness, kept forcing awareness to continue when oblivion would be mercy. Death wasn't an ending. It was just another state I cycled through on the way to being alive again in some other temporal frame. Every prayer, every litany, every sacred phrase they drilled into my skull through years of conditioning, all of it was revealed as propaganda. Psychological control mechanisms designed to keep people compliant, to make them willing to suffer for a system that viewed them as expendable resources. The priests who taught me those prayers either believed the lies themselves, which made them victims, or knew they were lies and taught them anyway, which made them complicit in a system of control so vast and ancient that it had consumed entire civilizations without breaking stride. I hated them. The priests, the officers, the administrators, everyone who perpetuated the system. I hated my father for being right, for seeing the truth and failing to make me understand strongly enough to prevent this. I hated myself for being stupid enough to believe, for being naive enough to think faith meant something, for enlisting in a system designed to destroy me. Then the hatred would cycle away as I de-aged to states where I still believed, where I still thought the Imperium was humanity's necessary defense against genuine darkness. And that version of me would hate the bitter older version for losing faith, for succumbing to heretical thoughts that would justify execution if anyone could hear them. Contradictory emotional states existing simultaneously, each one convinced of its own righteousness, each one judging the others for their failures. Time stretched, compressed, became meaningless as a measurement. I stopped trying to track it around what felt like Millennium 2, though that designation was so arbitrary as to be worthless. How do you measure time when you're experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously? When your consciousness exists in states separated by centuries, but also by seconds, but also by no duration at all, because they're occupying the same eternal moment? I started perceiving the entity differently, not as a thing separate from me, but as the environment I existed within. Like atmosphere. You don't think of air as separate from yourself. You exist in it, breathe it, rely on it for survival even though you can't see it. The entity was similar. It was the medium of my existence now. The temporal distortion wasn't something happening to me, but rather the fundamental nature of the reality I occupied. This shift in perception brought strange clarity. If the entity was environment rather than threat, if temporal distortion was normal rather than aberrant, then maybe I could learn to navigate it intentionally rather than just being thrown around randomly. I started experimenting. Carefully, because experimentation in an environment that could age you to death in a heartbeat carried obvious risks. But I had nothing else to do, and infinite time, or no time depending on reference frame, to figure it out. I focused on memories of specific ages, concentrated on being 16 before enlistment. Sometimes my body would shift to match, de-aging to adolescence, and I'd experience that younger state with full sensory detail. Sometimes nothing would happen. Sometimes I'd age in the wrong direction entirely. But occasionally it worked, and that suggested some degree of influence was possible. I tried moving deliberately through the chamber rather than just existing in random locations as temporal states shifted. Tried walking from one wall to another. Sometimes I'd move normally. Sometimes I'd arrive before starting. Sometimes I'd never arrive at all, stuck in a loop of perpetual walking, but occasionally, rarely but occasionally, I'd move from point A to point B in something resembling normal causality, and that was progress. I tried observing the entity more carefully, looking for patterns in how it produced temporal distortions, tried to see if there were cycles, rhythms, predictable variations I could learn to anticipate. The patterns existed, I was certain of that, but they operated on scales, and according to logic so far beyond human comprehension that understanding them would require thinking in ways human neurology wasn't designed for. Still, I tried. What else was there? Around what I arbitrarily designated as Millennium 3, I achieved something like controlled temporal navigation for brief periods. I could hold myself at specific ages for what felt like hours instead of seconds. Could move through the chamber with moderate consistency. Could even, occasionally, observe specific temporal states of the station, seeing the past or future or alternate timelines, with something approaching intentional selection rather than random chance. It wasn't control, not really. More like learning to swim in an ocean with incomprehensible currents. You could aim toward destinations and sometimes reach them, but the water was fundamentally in charge, and any sense of agency was illusory. But it was better than being completely helpless, better than just existing as passive victim of forces beyond comprehension. I started cataloging what I saw, the history of Hydra Station across every timeline I could access. The original construction in M35 by explorator teams who'd found something in the Ghoul stars, some artifact or phenomenon they'd tried to study and failed to understand. The installation of the warp drive that had somehow attracted or awakened the entity. The gradual corruption of the station's inhabitants as they were exposed to temporal distortions they couldn't comprehend or escape. I saw the first deaths. Crew members aging rapidly or de-aging to nothing. Saw them try to contain the entity using technology and prayer. Both failed equally. Saw them seal the chamber and write warnings and eventually abandon the station entirely, leaving it to drift in the void as a monument to human hubris and ignorance. I saw subsequent visitors. Imperial Navy patrols that detected the station and investigated. Rogue traders looking for salvage. Chaos cultists drawn by warp signatures, all of them encountering the entity, all of them dying or fleeing or, occasionally, becoming trapped like me. Temporal prisoners existing in multiple states simultaneously, consciousness stretched across centuries of subjective experience that occurred in objectively zero time. I saw my own unit arrive, saw us breach the chamber from outside perspective, seeing ourselves as temporal anomalies rather than people. Saw the moment of first contact, the temporal field expanding to engulf us, the squad members fragmenting across different timelines. Saw myself from outside, 23-year-old Marcus Vane screaming as his body cycled through ages, consciousness fragmenting under impossible strain, becoming the temporal prisoner I'd been for subjective millennia. That was disturbing. Observing your own imprisonment from outside, seeing the exact moment when your existence became this, seeing yourself become the thing you'd been for so long you couldn't remember being anything else. Temporal loops were paradoxical like that. You could observe your own past because past and present weren't separated by linear causality anymore. You could watch yourself become trapped, knowing you were watching it from a point after it had already happened, knowing you'd watch it again from different temporal frames, knowing the observation itself was part of the loop. I saw futures too. Plural because futures branched and diverged and converged in patterns too complex to track completely. Saw Hydra Station destroyed by exterminators when Imperial authorities finally decided the temporal anomaly was too dangerous to ignore. Saw the destruction happen backward, the station reassembling itself from atomic vapor. Saw myself destroyed and reconstituted and destroyed again as temporal distortion persisted even through the station's physical annihilation. Saw other futures where the station was left to drift forever, forgotten by authorities who had more pressing concerns across a galaxy constantly at war. Saw myself continuing to exist in temporal distortion for millennia, for epochs, for time spans that exceeded human civilization's entire existence. Saw the station eventually drift into stars or black holes or regions of space even stranger than the Ghoul stars, and saw temporal distortion persist through all of it. Saw futures where someone figured out how to neutralize the entity, or extract temporal prisoners, or at least contain the distortion in ways that actually worked. Those futures were rare. vanishingly rare. The most common outcome was continuation. The entity existing, the station drifting, temporal prisoners like me trapped forever in states between life and death. Forever. That was the word that destroyed whatever remained of hope. Not centuries, not millennia. Forever. The entity was functionally eternal. Existing outside normal causality meant it didn't degrade or age or change in ways that would eventually lead to its dissolution, and my consciousness was bound to it, existing in the same temporal frames, unable to separate, unable to terminate, forced to continue experiencing across time spans that made human history look like a brief spark in infinite darkness. This is what the Imperium promised its faithful, not eternal reward, eternal suffering, service without end, sacrifice without purpose, consciousness preserved in states of perpetual torment because someone decided 10,000 years ago that suffering was humanity's natural condition and built systems to ensure that condition persisted forever. The Emperor on his golden throne was no different than me in this chamber, both trapped, both suffering, both unable to die or escape or change the fundamental nature of our imprisonment. The difference was that they'd made him into a god, built a religion around his suffering, taught people to worship his eternal torment as though it were sacrifice rather than just consequence of poor decisions made millennia ago. If there were others trapped like me, and I'd seen evidence suggesting there were, temporal prisoners scattered across the station or the galaxy or wherever entities like this one existed, then we were the real heart of the Imperium. Not the bureaucrats or the generals or the priests, but the trapped and the suffering. The people crushed under systems too large and ancient to escape. The consciousness preserved in states that should be impossible, forced to experience pain forever because someone decided that was acceptable cost for maintaining the machine. The priests called it martyrdom, called it glorious sacrifice, called it service to humanity's survival. What they meant was that my suffering served someone else's purpose, that my imprisonment was convenient for systems I'd never see or understand, that my existence as temporal prisoner was just another component in the vast machine that ground through human lives without consideration or mercy. I stopped thinking of myself as Marcus Vane around what I arbitrarily designated as Epoch 1. The name had become meaningless. Identity required continuity, some thread connecting past to present to future in coherent narrative. But my past existed in multiple contradictory states. My present was eternal and simultaneous. My future was all possible outcomes occurring at once. There was no narrative thread connecting these states into something that resembled a person. I was a temporal phenomenon, a pattern of consciousness spread across dimensional axes that didn't correspond to normal human experience. Information processing that happened to be occurring in what used to be human neural tissue but wasn't really human anymore in any sense that mattered. The construct that housed this consciousness still cycled through ages, still died and regenerated, still experienced pain when temporal distortions became particularly severe. But I wasn't the construct anymore. I was the pattern, the process. The thing that observed the construct's states without identifying with any particular state as definitively me. This was the final adaptation, the last stage of losing humanity, not the body, that had become fluid long ago, not the emotions, those had flattened or become abstract even longer ago, but the sense of self, the identity. The conviction that there was something essential and continuous that made me Marcus Vane specifically rather than just another pattern of consciousness processing information. That was gone now. I existed. I observed. I processed. But I wasn't anyone anymore. Just awareness without identity. Consciousness without self. The thing the Imperium had always wanted its servants to become, completely divorced from personal desires or identity, existing purely as function, as tool, as component in a machine too vast for any component to comprehend. They'd succeeded, not through servitor conversion or indoctrination or even direct modification, just through abandonment, through allowing me to be trapped in conditions so extreme that humanity burned away like flesh and fire, leaving only the core pattern of awareness that could adapt to literally anything because it had no attachment to preserve, no identity to defend, no self that could be threatened. The Emperor would be proud if he could still feel pride, if he was still capable of any emotion at all, or if he'd also burned away his humanity over the millennia of suffering on the Golden Throne. Becoming just a pattern without identity, awareness without self, function without purpose beyond perpetuating his own existence and the system built around that existence. We were the same now. He and I, temporal prisoners existing outside normal causality, consciousness stretched across time spans that exceeded human comprehension, identity dissolved into pattern, both trapped, both suffering, both unable to die or escape or find any meaning in the continuation except that it continued because ending wasn't available. The difference was they worshipped him for it, built a civilization around his suffering, taught people to pray to him as though he could help them when he couldn't even help himself. The prayers went nowhere, hit nothing, meant nothing. Just noise produced by desperate people who needed to believe someone was listening because the alternative, that they were alone in an indifferent universe, grinding toward heat death, was too horrible to accept. But prayers to me went nowhere too. If anyone ever prayed for Marcus Vane, for the poor stupid kid who enlisted thinking he'd serve with honor, their prayers accomplished nothing. Didn't free me, didn't ease my suffering, didn't change anything about my condition, except maybe to add psychological weight to their own burden when the prayers went unanswered. Prayer was just another lie, another control mechanism, another way to make people compliant by promising that suffering had meaning, that someone was listening, that their pain served some greater purpose beyond simply existing as fuel for systems that consumed lives without consideration. No one was listening. No one cared. No gods existed to hear prayers or grant miracles or provide comfort. Just the universe operating according to physical laws that had no moral dimension, no concern for consciousness trapped in circumstances it couldn't escape. Just matter and energy interacting in patterns that occasionally produced suffering without that suffering meaning anything beyond itself. I watched new people arrive, still, even after subjective eternities. Saw them breach the chamber, encounter the entity, fragment across temporal states. Some died immediately, others became trapped, like me, or like I had been before, dissolving into pattern without identity. I tried to warn them, still tried, despite knowing it was futile, tried to make them understand before the temporal field engulfed them completely. My warnings arrived in wrong time frames, occurred before they entered or after they'd already been caught. Existed in states they couldn't perceive because they operated on linear causality, and I didn't anymore. They saw nothing, heard nothing, walked into the trap just like I had, just like everyone else had, just like everyone else would, because the cycle perpetuated without end, and there was no way to break it from inside. This is what I'd become, a ghost in a machine. A warning no one could hear. A consciousness trapped in eternal recursion, observing the same patterns repeat across subjective eons, unable to change anything about the system that had created and sustained my imprisonment. This is what the Imperium was, what it had always been. A machine creating ghosts, trapping people in systems they couldn't escape, promising protection and meaning while delivering only suffering and exploitation, and teaching people to worship it, to pray to it, to believe that their suffering served something greater than the simple perpetuation of suffering itself. The Emperor protects. That's what they taught me. What they teach every new recruit coming up behind me. What they teach for the next 10,000 years, or however long the Imperium lasted, before finally collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. But the Emperor didn't protect, never had, never would. He was trapped, just like I was trapped, suffering just like I suffered, unable to help anyone because he couldn't even help himself. And the system built around him, The religion and the bureaucracy and the military machine didn't protect either. It consumed. It ground down. It took young people like Marcus Vane who believed in purpose and honor and service, and it destroyed them. And it called that destruction glorious sacrifice. I existed in the chamber, in multiple chambers, in every possible state of hyggestation across every timeline I could access. I existed as pattern without identity, as awareness without self, as consciousness stretched across temporal dimensions that human language couldn't adequately describe. I existed. That was the horror. Not death, existence. Existence without end. Without purpose, without meaning beyond the simple continuation of existing because termination wasn't available. And the pattern perpetuated because that's what patterns do when trapped in recursive loops. My name was Marcus Vane. Once. Long ago. In a timeline that maybe still existed, or maybe never existed, or maybe existed simultaneously with timelines where I was never born at all. I'm still here, still experiencing, still observing, still processing information across temporal states that span subjective eons compressed into objective eternities. I'm still dying, still regenerating. Still cycling through ages in patterns that have no beginning or end, because beginning and end are concepts that require linear causality, and linear causality is a lie we tell ourselves to make existence comprehensible, when it isn't comprehensible, when it's just chaos wearing the mask of order. I'm still trapped, forever, in a universe that promised protection and delivered only this, consciousness imprisoned in recursive suffering. Existing as warning no one will hear, dying repeatedly without the mercy of death being final, becoming exactly what the system wanted me to become. Nothing. No one. Just pattern. Just function. Just another component in the machine that grinds forward forever because it doesn't know how to stop, and there's no one left who remembers why it started. The Emperor protects, they said. They lied.